Good evening and welcome everyone. My name is Marcela Guerrero, pronouns she, her, ella in Espanol. I'm one of the assistant curators at the Whitney Museum. Before I begin my opening remarks, I want to remind those who want to access closed captioning in English that they can do so by turning on this feature on the options bar below. We are also privileged to have our friends from Colectivo Babilla who will be providing live interpretation in gender inclusive Spanish. They will now give us a brief tutorial on how to access this feature.
Thank you, Marcela. Hi, everybody. My name is Cristobal. I am an interpreter with Colectivo Avilla. I will be providing simultaneous interpretation with my colleague Pau today. So just a quick overview, I will be giving this announcement in English and in Spanish before interpretation goes live. Voy a dar este anuncio en inglés y en español. Soy parte del Colectivo Avilla. Voy a estar interpretando simultáneamente hoy con mi colega Pau. Para accesar este servicio, simplemente mire abajo en la sección de botones, un botón que dice interpretación. At the bottom right of your screen, you'll see a button that says interpretation. You click on that button, you select the language that you want to hear interpretation in. Una vez presione ese botón, puede escuchar el canal del lenguaje al que quiere escuchar la interpretación. We can switch at will on our side as interpreters, so we will switch accordingly to the language spoken in the presentation. Una vez escoja el canal que quiere escuchar la interpretación, nosotros como intérpretes podemos cambiar el canal, así que vamos a cambiar el canal de interpretación dependiendo de lo que se hable en la presentación. As Marcela mentioned, we will be doing interpretation into gender inclusive language. Como mencionó Marcela, vamos a hacer interpretación en lenguaje inclusivo al español. Y si tienen algún problema con la interpretación, pueden enviarnos un mensaje a mi o a Pau. Tenemos intérprete en nuestro nombre. As Marcela mentioned, we'll be doing gender inclusive interpretation into Spanish. If you have any issues and need help troubleshooting, you can send a message to me or Pau. We both have interpreter listed on our names. We do ask folks to speak at a moderate pace so we can catch everything that you're interpreting. And if you do have issues and you need help troubleshooting, you can message whoever of the interpreters is on mute at the moment. Sí pedimos que las personas hablen en un paso moderado para poder interpretarles correctamente. Y si tienen algún problema con la interpretación, nos pueden escribir a quien sea el intérprete que no está en silencio en ese momento. Thank you and have a great meeting. Gracias y que tengan una buena reunión.
So thank you, Morgan Pate from LC Interpreting Services for the live captioning, and thank you, Cristobal and Pau, for providing simultaneous interpretation in Spanish. I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the ancestral lands of the Canarsie and Munsee Lenape, otherwise known as Crown Heights, Brooklyn. I encourage everyone to take a moment to identify and recognize the indigenous lands from where you're joining us. I would also like to express my solidarity with the families and communities that have lost loved ones or have suffered as a consequence of white supremacy. A deep level of gratitude also goes to those who have been affected by this pandemic and who are tuning in tonight. So welcome to the third and final event in the trilogy of programs highlighting recent scholarship on Latinx arts and culture hosted by the Whitney. Tonight's event is a talk organized on the occasion of the publication of Elizabeth Ferrer's book, Latinx Photography in the United States, A Visual History, published by the University of Washington Press, who is kindly offering 30% discount. And you will get that link and the code in the chat. This incisive study on the role Latinx photographers have played in the history of this medium is the perfect culmination to a series that began with Chon Noriega and El Morales discussing Morales' book, Latinx, The New Force in Politics and Culture, and continued with Adriana Zavala and Arlene Davila conversation around Davila's book, Latinx Art, Artists, Markets, and Politics. As a reminder, these talks are archived on the Whitney's YouTube page. I've never been so excited to hear a chisme about a book until I heard through the grapevine that you were about to publish this book, Elizabeth. Reading Latinx photography crystallized for me the important role that each of us as art workers play in preserving the legacy of Latinx art. We owe everything to artists because it all starts with them, but it is contributions such as yours, Elizabeth, that solidify their scholarly presence in academia and the art world. Similarly, it is the responsibility of professors such as Roberto Tejada, and dare I say even those who are not Latinx, to teach this material in their classes. And likewise, it is my duty and that of other curators to exhibit, collect, and preserve Latinx art for the present and for posterity, and by extension to collectors, critics, conservators, etc. We invited Roberto to be in dialogue with Elizabeth tonight because perhaps no other scholar or person could have been a better match to explore the motivations for this book and some of the insights it contains. In addition to his expansive expertise in photography, Roberto also has that enviable disposition of being a generous listener and astute responder. We are honored to have you both here today. So it is my pleasure to introduce these two distinguished speakers who are also outstanding individuals. Elizabeth Ferrer is Vice President of Contemporary Art and Chief Curator at BRIC in Brooklyn. In addition to celebrating the publication of her book, we want to extend a heartfelt congratulations for the opening of her recent exhibition, Latinx Abstract, which runs through May 2nd at BRIC. Roberto Tejada is a translator, editor, essayist, photography historian, and critic specializing in Latinx and Latin American art. He is currently the Hugh Roy and Lillie Cullen Distinguished Professor at the University of Houston. His most recent publication is the full-length poetry collection, Still Nowhere in an Empty Vastness, published in 2019. And before I turn the conversation to Elizabeth and Roberto, I want to go over the run of show. Elizabeth will begin by reading an excerpt from her book, and then she and Roberto will have a conversation and will also show some images by photographers whose work is included in the book. We have reserved 10 to 15 minutes for questions from the audience. I encourage everyone to submit their questions via the Q&A function at any point in the evening. If you have any technical difficulties, please let us know using the same box, and our team will do their best to help you. I turn it to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, Marcela, for that very generous introduction. I want to thank everybody at the Whitney for organizing this program. It comes at such a wonderful time because the book has just now officially been released. It's been a long time coming for me. I've spent several years writing it. What we want to do to begin is I will read a passage from the book. And this will talk about my impetus for writing it, the motivations, and just some of the framework. So, and before I do that though, I'd like to acknowledge that I am currently in Western Massachusetts, homeland to the Mohican and to the Munsee people. So now I'll begin. The impetus for this book is derived from a basic fact. By and large, Latinx photographers are excluded from the history of American photography. And yet they have been highly active practitioners of the medium nearly since its inception in 1839. This book focuses primarily on those active since the late 1960s, the same period when the photographic medium gained broad acceptance as an art form, and when civil rights movements among people of color were in full flourish. It also offers introductions to figures of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, working as studio or itinerant portraitists, photojournalists, and documentarians. These photographers represent ethnic groups that now constitute nearly 18% of the US population. The majority are members of the largest Latinx populations in the United States, whose lineage descends from Mexico, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. Reflecting the growth and evolution of the Latinx community, this study also includes photographers whose heritage is rooted in the Dominican Republic and in Central and South American countries. I consider the cultural production of these groups in tandem, recognizing their diversity, but also because of the many elements that bind us. They include, above all, the legacy of Spanish colonialism, which imposed the Spanish language, Roman Catholicism, and European institutional forms in the Americas. We also share complex bicultural outlooks, histories of immigration, and experiences with marginalization and forms of cultural erasure. All of this has compelled Latinx photographers and Latinx artists in general to work purposefully, driven by a deep sense of social and political commitment. The scant awareness of this work is in great part due simply to lack of exposure. There has been no single book on Latinx photography before this one, no comprehensive museum exhibition, and to the best of my knowledge, no course taught in American colleges or universities. And what has also become clear to me is the near complete omission of older practitioners from the historical record. Inadequately studied and absent from texts on American photography, the oeuvres of earlier generations comprise a great unwritten history. The visual records that do exist are scattered, preserved in libraries, archives, and historical societies, small and large. but much is clearly lost. And perhaps one of the richest veins of this work is in old family collections, stored away in photo albums, shoeboxes, and today in the digital realm. It is high time, therefore, to recognize these voices and to appreciate these bodies of work as essential to the visual history of the United States. This book then offers a parallel history of American photography, one that must no longer be seen at the margins. Thank you. And I think Roberto Tejada will be joining us in a moment.
So I can hear you, but I am
There you
now.
are.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Andy, is there something I need to do so as to be present?
I can see you. I can hear you.
Okay. Excellent.
I can see you, Roberto.
Very good. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you to the Whitney as well. I'm really excited to be in conversation with you. I'm speaking to you from Houston, and I'd like to acknowledge the lands of the Karankawa peoples as well. So, Elizabeth, I just want to say that it's been a real learning experience. I've learned, and it's been a pleasure to read this book. It has a scope that is really remarkable, and also kind of a swiftness and energy around its narrative format. So I just wanted to acknowledge so that those out listening and tuning in today get a sense of what the book covers, which is to say that it moves from, say, the roots and antecedents from the 1840s, at the beginnings of photography, and it goes into the rise of the Latinx consciousness in American photography, but it also looks at some of the sort of overlooked photographers from the mid-century, in the 20th century, figures like Pedro Guerrero, who was this mid-century photographer who took architectural photographs of Frank Lloyd Wright, Philip Johnson, others. Jesse Fernandez, who was friends with Wilfredo Lam and Marcel Duchamp, took photographs of literary figures like Jorge Luis Borges and Guillermo Cabrera Infante. And then, in addition to telling sort of the panoramic scope and the sort of the long distance scope, it also goes into a sort of thematics. So, and I think some of these themes will be coming up as we discuss the images that we've brought in today, that you brought in today, looking at how contemporary photographers use staging of the self for telling narratives about culture, questions about the family, the importance of the archive, the sort of connections and disconnections to geography. And I think this, in a way, kind of points back, in a sense, to some of the curatorial work that you've done, Elizabeth. For example, I think of A Shadow Born of Earth, the new photography from Mexico that you curated in the 1990s. And so I thought that maybe we could begin, since we have the photograph of the cover here of your book, if you would say a couple of comments about this wonderful photograph by Max Aguilera Helweg, which graces the cover. And I think it serves as a kind of shorthand for some of the visuality we see in the book, but also some of the themes that you discuss in the book.
Thank you. So Max Aguilera Helweg is really a fascinating, unique figure. Born in 1955, a Chicano photographer. He actually discovered photography by looking through his father's old photo albums. And his father was a soldier in World War II, and that hooked him. And he began to take photographs as a teenager. This is from a relatively early series from 1989. The series is called La Frontera Sin Sonrisa, the border without smiles. And this particular photo is the lovers. And it's really a beautiful black and white analog series where Max was traveling kind of parallel, remembering what he did as a kid, which is go back and forth across the border as a child, which is something that I also remember doing, going to Tijuana, going to Ensenada. His family did something very similar. And he went with his camera. And I think it's so interesting. He's working with a 4x5 field camera. and taking these photographs very slowly. So he's on the one hand recovering this image of Mexico, but on the other hand also thinking about these itinerant photographers from the 19th century, both in Mexico and the Southwest, who would travel with these cameras. And when they did, they were making these very long exposure pictures, so you couldn't smile for them. So part of that is sin sonrisa, is that these are long exposures, but it's also, it's about the pain of the border. It's about the pain of traveling back and forth in this kind of artificial delineation, creating so much hardship and pain from north to south. The photographs are really varied. There are photographs of kids in East LA, where I grew up, of female gang members from the same neighborhood where I grew up, workers, it's, for me, it's just a classic series of sort of early Latinx photography. Max went on to get his degree as a medical doctor and has practiced as a physician, but has also made very, very different work dealing with the body and health, sometimes in a very documentary way. He's photographed surgeries and documented heart surgery, but also making these sort of surrealistic film noir type images. And he has also had a career as a filmmaker. So, you know, it's hard to pick an individual picture that is emblematic of such a broad scope. The book covers 80 or so photographers, but this image for me is just very magnetic and beautiful.
And I think that it's interesting that what is brought together here, and I think it's a theme in the book, is the traditional and the contemporary, that he's using a traditional form of taking the photograph with a very contemporary and apparently now obsolete film. There's apparently a lot of interest in this Type 55 Polaroid film that he used that has this particular quality. And I think he also used these kind of light sources from different sides of the couple in this case to give the kind of luminosity that the black and white has.
Yeah, that, and also, you know, and you mentioned one of the chapters in my book is about geographies. I think that's also something that just comes up time and again. You know, there's this idea of aquí y allá. You know, in some cases for Cuban photographers who left Cuba as young children and deal with the issue of exile. Puerto Rican photographers who are traveling back and forth between San Juan and New York or other cities. Chicano photographers who are thinking about their relation to Mexico or their lack of relation to Mexico. And we're going to talk about some of those things in a few minutes.
We took some of the series in Mexico City and in Lima, if I'm not mistaken, but also in Piedras Negras and on the border.
Right, and I think that for Chicano photographers, I think that relationship has changed. You know, one of the things that's interesting to me is that I have included, you know, most of the photographers are either Chicano, Puerto Rican, or Cuban American, but there are many others as well. And, you know, especially when we talk about the late 60s and 1970s, when the real core of the book begins, there are photographers, Chicano photographers covering El Movimiento. And on the other hand, there's Puerto Rican photographers who are in New York, who are part of social protest movements against the state of Puerto Rican neighborhoods in New York. They weren't really in dialogue, but one of the kind of the cruxes was Mexico. You know, there were these colloquios of photography in the late 1970s and early 80s. And a good number of these photographers were invited to attend and to speak and to show their work. And so in that very early period of Latinx photography, Mexico actually provided the network, you know, you know, in the days well before the internet.
And you bring these sort of hemispheric geographies to bear in so many of the chapters. And maybe that has something to do with another question I want to begin the conversation with, is your definition of this term that either puzzles some because of its newness, this idea of the Latinx as a kind of explanation or description of those of us who live in the United States who are Latin American descendant, but who don't have, as Arlene Davila would say, the privilege of the national.
Mm-hmm. It's a complicated term, and I've struggled with it myself, but I came down very strongly that I did want to use this term. You know, as I mentioned in the introduction, I read there are photographers that represent various ethnic groups, and in addition to these groups, there are, you know, photographers from you know, from several other countries in Latin America. But I do think that we are linked by these qualities that I mentioned. I mean, basically Latinx is simply a word that, Latino is a gender term. And so Latinx respects all gender preferences. And that to me is very important. For me, it's a forward-looking term. It's a word that came out of our community. Words like Hispanic, I mean, that started as a census term, and I'm surprised to see it still used so commonly. It's not an easy term to use grammatically, and it's not an easy word to use when we're thinking about our history. I also use the word Chicanx in the book, but when it came to talking about the Chicano civil rights movement, in the late 1960s and 70s, I kept with that because that is how that movement was known.
I think as well that it's future looking. Many of the scholars who have been thinking about this, like Claudia Milian and
that's how I was, yeah.
Right, there's this idea that it's really looking towards a kind of openness of the future that this allows, and the kind of the queering of the Latino through the Latinx, and that it's an openness to include all kinds of fluidities, including the fluidities of sexual and gender presentations.
I just want to say two other things. First of all, like the X is like a punctuation, right? It really kind of, this marks the spot. It's a kind of a declaration of self. But the other thing is that, we all have these intersectional identities. We're made up of many different parts. And so, I can be Latinx and Chicana, or I can be, or somebody can be Latinx and Boricua. Latinx is not an all-defining term. But it is a very forward way of owning this aspect of our identity and feeling very positive about it.
Yeah, I like a young scholar and poet, Alan Pelais Lopez, calls it both a wound because it talks about those histories of slavery and colonization as well, but it's also an unknown insofar as it's that sort of variable that you've discussed.
And what Arlene Davila talks about in her book is that it's important for us to come together under this word, because whatever country of origin we're from, as Latinx people, we've all suffered from displacement and marginalization and forms of erasure. And so, this is a coming together of people who are, at this moment, I think, receiving a lot of attention for our culture, for our, for social justice issues. And so for me, being Latinx right now, at this point in time with a new presidential administration, I just feel it's very positive.
This might be a nice segue into the next image, if we could, because we'll talk about some of the origins of this sort of history of Latinx photography. And maybe you could say something about the civil rights movement in which both the Chicano, Chicanx photographers begin, and we'll move into some of the Puerto Rican photographers as well. So that will give sort of a sort of first background, and then we'll move to the contemporary.
So, as you mentioned, there's some really interesting photographers from the first half of the 20th century. And all, they're all worthy of monographs and solo exhibitions. Actually, John Candelario did have a solo show at MoMA, I think. So that was kind of a unique instance. But really, for me, the book begins in the 1960s with the civil rights movements throughout the United States. And that is because this is when these photographers are beginning to make their work with an ethnic and political consciousness. So they're making their work as Chicanos, as Puerto Ricans. This is a photograph by George Rodriguez, who's a Los Angeles photographer. Another really fascinating background. George started his career working for a Hollywood photography lab and was also a celebrity photographer in Hollywood. But he was very aware of what was going on in East Los Angeles, and he began to bear witness basically with his camera. So this is, and so he did a lot of photographs of protest movements as well as everyday life, but this is a photograph that was made in 1970 at the Chicano Moratorium, which was at the time the largest assembly of Mexican Americans ever. And it was primarily against the draft, which was taking a disproportionate number of Chicano men, but it became a much broader movement. And George was one of the photographers who was sort of right in the center of all that. But there are many as well, if we can look at the next image.
Perfect.
So these two photographers were made under the auspices of the United Farm Workers. So there was another large group of photographers, both Chicano and non-Chicano, who were attracted to Cesar Chavez and to the organizing work that he and Dolores Huerta were doing in California's Central Valley. And you know, I picked these two photographs of women because the movement is also often seen as very male, but of course there were many women farm workers, and these are photographs by photographers who work for the UFW. They work for just you know, a few dollars a week, and you know, they're not well known. They were not making their work as artists. They were making their work because they were committed to the social justice movement.
What's interesting,
Go ahead.
these images probably circulated in the journals of the United Farm Workers, the El Malcriado, which then were seen, right? Which then were seen in the urban working class and middle class Chicanos and Chicanas, who were then led to protests like the Chicano moratorium that we saw in the anterior image, and what we'll see coming up as well. So there's this interesting way in which newspapers and media and magazines like El Malcriado and La Raza, which we'll get to, were raising that kind of consciousness through photography as a social medium.
Yeah, and not only that, I mean, for people like this is really the first time that they're seeing photographs of themselves with agency, you know, positive images. You know, if you were to look at the mass media, I mean, this is also the era of like the big illustrated magazines like Life and Time and Look. And so there was just a lot of visual imagery. But if you saw an article, say about Chicano communities like East Los Angeles, they were they focused on the negative. They focused on you know, on criminals. They focused on poverty and rundown neighborhoods. And poverty and rundown neighborhoods did exist, but when people are photographing their own communities, they photograph them in a much more nuanced way. And so, you know, photographing these women who are part of protest movements show that these women also have a kind of voice. You know, it's a voice that they may be a little ambivalent about. You know, this woman is holding her scarf over her mouth, but they're out there, they're protesting. And I think the other thing that's very important about images like this is these visual symbols. So the huelga symbol, the eagle, which comes from the myth of the founding of Mexico and as a symbol of power. You know, you see these kind of symbols over and over again in these photographs and in you know, other graphic images in El Malcriado.
So in addition to these women farm workers, I think another link will be the next image, if we could, which is the image of the importance of religiosity and La Virgen de Guadalupe. But maybe we might move to the next photograph, which is of the student movement and the walkouts that led to this photograph. And you can talk a little bit about that magazine and the journal La Raza.
So La Raza was started as a newspaper. It eventually turned into a magazine. It was, you know, done with, you know, very, very little budget. It hired mostly student photographers. Most of them were amateurs. I think most of them were working as volunteers. And they were photographing sort of day in, day out, this more urban manifestation. So these students and, you know, and other people, as you said, they were inspired by Cesar Chavez. They saw these images of these mass demonstrations. So in 1968, there was this series of walkouts from Los Angeles high schools, and I think even from junior high schools. These students were protesting the poor education they were receiving. They were protesting the poor opportunities they had once they left school. And this became a really large manifestation in Los Angeles. You know, I mean, in neighborhoods like East LA, all the schools had walkouts. And so La Raza was covering this. They were also covering police violence. So, you know, we don't have time to go through everything, but there are a lot of images of police oppression and violence. And so these photographers were also sort of putting themselves on the line. And I think that La Raza is especially important because it accumulated an archive of something like 25,000 photographs. I believe this one for me, I think is very powerful, but I don't think we know the name of the photographer. And I think they're working on that right now.
Is that right? I agree. It's very powerful. I mean, it has the protest signs that say, "Is education a crime? By all means necessary." And then the subject who's the center of the photograph holding what seems to be, either a microphone and an adapter for the cassette recorder that he has in his other hand, which talks about how they were actually quite involved in and savvy in terms of media representation. One can go to something like the Pacifica radio station, KPFK in LA, which has many of the recordings of some of the student organizers from the walkouts at that time.
Mhm.
So maybe we could move to now from one coast, the West Coast, to the East Coast, and you could tell
Right.
us something about the Young Lords and how they organized and had a visuality through photography as well.
Right. So now we're in New York, and there were many photographers that worked in and around the Young Lords and were working in the city at the time. So, here we are in the late 60s when, white flight is really changing the city. The tax base is going down. Neighborhoods of people of color were really beginning to decay. Landlords would rather torch the buildings than keep them up. There were a lot of problems in the public schools. And so the quality of life, for Puerto Rican people and African-American people, had not been good for a long time, but there was much more organizing going on. The Young Lords originally started in Chicago, and a branch started in New York. So here are the Young Lords protesting. They were rather militant. You could see they kind of lined up, and they were very organized in their protests. They were very active in both Bronx and Upper Manhattan. And one photographer, Hugh Mirastani, was their official photographer. He came to photography not unlike Max as a teenager, and just started photographing. And I remember he once said, when he told his mother he was going to be a photographer, his mother said, people like us never become photographers, Hiram, but he did. And the Young Lords had him as his official photographer. So you see a lot of images like this in his archive of protest marches. And we can go to the next photograph. This is a pretty legendary event. This is the garbage offensive, when the city wasn't picking up garbage in Spanish Harlem. And so they created these blockades. And, they really the Young Lords had a really positive effect. The city really acted to criminalize them, but they were very involved in social services for their communities, improving schools, and simple things like, getting the trash to get picked up. So Max was there, Hiram was there photographing all this. And, a lot of this photography became forgotten after the 60s and 70s. Fortunately, Hiram's work has, I guess, been rediscovered. One artist, Miguel Luciano, actually created these massive banners that he hung in these neighborhoods exactly where these events happened. And there was recently a large exhibition of the Young Lords at El Museo and the Bronx Museum. So I think that people have begun to see a lot more of this photography, and it's just very, very powerful. On the other hand, and I don't think we have those photos to show, Hiram was also photographing everyday life in the community. And he was also, a photographer who, he lived in this community, he worked in this community, and he was able to show the positive side. So there's, a lot of photographs of families, of kids playing. It's really a beautiful archive, and I hope it gets much more exposure.
But maybe this might be the nice transition, which is that if the photographers around La Raza and Hiram Mirastani were keen to provide self-representation when there were other media representations that were negative, this was about showing public visibility and manifestations, self-affirmation, and protest, as the garbage offensive describes. And I think some of the contemporary photographers go back to this idea of the grassroots, documenting a community, but also using the media as a way to prompt action or ideas. So maybe we might.
Sure.
And this you've brought up two artists, two photographers who I think best represent this. So maybe you want to say something about the two of them, and then we'll move into their work.
Sure. So we decided to focus on two more contemporary photographers so that we could go in depth on both. And I think that there's a broad arc to their work. They've both been working for decades. So the photographer on the left is Cristina Fernandez. She's a Chicana photographer born in 1965. Has always lived in and around Los Angeles. She's worked on most of her work is done in series, and she tends to work with very distinct photographic methods. So here you see her overlaying her image over a historic image. She's done more topographical work. She's done stage photography. And then the other photographer is Cuban-American, Maria Martinez Cañas. She was born in 1960, came to the United States or came to Puerto Rico as I think an infant, and was raised in Puerto Rico, and then came to the United States for school. So she's been living in Miami for, I think, since the mid 1980s. I think her work is marked very much by her condition of exile. She never returned. She's never visited Cuba except for her time there as an infant. She's really known for working with really experimental photographic media. She's always pushed the media that she uses. So she works with photo montage, and as we'll see towards the end, even with kind of a sculptural approach to photography.
Yes, and that image on the right is duplicity as identity, and I think that's a theme that we'll look at as well. But maybe we can move to Cristina Fernandez's first work, which I think harkens back to the ways in which many of the contemporary photographers make reference to the history of photography and to family stories, as you so beautifully write in that chapter about families.
And to migration. So this for me is really an emblematic series, I think, and important to the whole kind of corpus of Latinx photography. Maria's Great Expedition. So this is a series that she made between 1995 and 96. There's 6 images, and there's also a map. And when she has displayed this, she does it more kind of like a somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but like a history museum display. It's a story that's based on the story of her great-grandmother, who came from Mexico in the 19th century as an unwed mother with a child. And one of the things I love about the series is that each photograph kind of maps to a photographic technique. So the first photograph where you see Maria as a young woman in this kind of very sepia tone image. And there's also kind of a funny use of objects in each of the photos, and most of the photos that don't really belong. So for example, you see in the second photo where she's working as a laundress, you also see her kind of carrying a fanny pack, which was not invented at that time. So she's also kind of playing with this idea of very carefully staging these images so that they have this historic sensibility, but at the other time kind of nudging you to understand, this is Cristina Fernandez herself in these photos. And there's a fictive element as well. These are recreations.
And each photograph has a text in the original installation, and as well as a map. Maybe we could see the next image, which has some of the other kind of styles that include sort of the modernist style that you might see in an Alvarez Bravo in the image to the left, and maybe the FSA style in the photograph to the right.
Right, and I think we can go on. And I love these because, here she is in Los Angeles, living in a housing project. And then the final one, the only one that's in color, where she sort of gazes at us. And, she's kind of maybe gazing at that history that she has played out. And she's carrying in her hand this flyer from a 99-cent store, which probably would not have existed. I think this might represent the 1950s. So I think that this series is so important because it just encapsulates all these themes. It's the story of women. It's a story of migration. It's this passage of time that and this kind of generational story. So I think that this is something that you can see like in many chapters of the book.
And in the next series, which we could pass on, I think there's also a connection to both the city of Los Angeles, and as we'll see in a couple of other images, this connection to Mexico and Mexican photography. But I think maybe you could say something about the Manuela stitched composition. These photographs have a kind of, I remember Cristina Fernandez talking about her interest in the new topographics and Louis Baltz. We're looking at these facades of sites in Los Angeles, and sightedness is really important. But what we come to know through some of the text here is that they're also garment factories. And there's this question of labor that's of interest to Cristina Fernandez's work, including the labor that her grandmother performed in the prior series.
Exactly. So there's a connection. So a lot of this work is sort of about the hidden labor,
Right.
of immigrants, or of Mexican Americans and other people of color in Los Angeles, and of course other cities. I think this is a series of 6 or 8 photographs. I think they're printed in fairly large scale, and they're also about the city and these sort of very banal aspects of the city. I think that a lot of times you can only see what's going on inside them because of these very small signs that might be at the door, that are really just there so that postal workers know to deliver the mail properly. She once mentioned that these images, aren't necessarily sweatshops, but they are garment factories, and it's just about this, really invisible labor that is happening, all over Los Angeles. But the way that of it is because when you walk by, you can hear the sewing machines.
And there's a whole ethnographic aspect to this project because she interviewed many of the garment workers and then used that text to craft another text that was part of this image as well, a kind of dream sequence in which one of the garment workers is afraid that La Migra, immigration authorities are going to capture her. But maybe we should move to the next.
Oh, let me just say something. So there's this whole story that she tells about a woman who runs out of the building, and I think a thread has been caught in her dress, and she realizes that the thread has gone around the corner and followed her path. Right. So I love this kind of level of precision in her work, and this kind of storytelling that can be both fictive and very real at the same time.
So the next series is then the ruins and the projected images that you showed before, exactly.
Right. So ruins, if we can go back, is part of a series of large-scale photographs that she made in the state of Oaxaca. And she had the experience with which many Chicanx people have of coming to Mexico for the first time. It actually reminds me of my own trajectory as a curator when I decided to work on Mexican art. And I started traveling to Mexico City, a place that I had never been, where I had family and where I had descendants. And returning to, or arriving to Mexico in that way is a very emotional experience. There's a lot of expectations and a lot of surprises that come into play. So this work, Ruins, is based at these archaeological sites in Oaxaca, these kind of not fully excavated sites like some of the famous ones. And she's talked about how these ruins are being kind of the only thing that is left of this memory. And so for her, this is sort of a very kind of emotional body of work about these ancient family lineages that we carry, but really don't know all about. And then there's a related series, if we can go to the next slide. These are a series of self-portraits that she made using or double exposures with famous works of Mexican photography from the modern period. So she's working with mostly male photographers, so Manuel Alvarez Bravo, Nacho Lopez, Gabriel Garcia Figueroa, and then there's the final one actually is Tina Madori, so one of the first female modernist photographers in Mexico. And she's talked about how she only knew these photographs in reproduction, and so she actually photographs herself against these reproductions. So the historic photos are pixelated, and she is trying to kind of reenact what it was like to have been these women being photographed by these male photographers. And for me, it's so interesting because, that's an area, Roberto, that you and I both know a lot about. And in kind of the whole project of modern Mexican photography, so many of these photographers were photographing indigenous people, so they're anonymous to us.
I mean, I think that's part of both projects, the ruins and then these untitled multiple exposures, which is that they do address the process of colonization and the ways in which the indigenous has been used both in the National Project for Mexico, but there's also a connection that she's trying to establish with these subjects, some of them who are anonymous, made by male Mexican photographers, but for the Tina Madori. And so there's both a connection and a kind of detachment or an impossibility to establish that connection that I think she describes also as many Chicano and Chicana artists have when they go to Mexico, that very kind of fraught idea of identification, but also some sort of distance.
Exactly, and she's using the history of photography to do that. So like Maria's Great Expedition, using these various photographic styles, here she's using the history of photography. And I think, you know, what I wonder is she laying claim to this, to modern Mexican photography as one of her main resources? Is she questioning that history? Is she, you know, is she questioning the relationship of the Chicana photographer to these Mexican male photographers? But what's for me so interesting is that she, as you can see now, she's used all these various conceptual approaches in her work, and yet the work is, on the other hand, you know, quite emotional, quite, you know, quite charged. And I love the way that she's able to kind of balance that expressive quality with this conceptual rigor in her work.
Maybe going back to the idea of labor in her this last series that we have, yes, the lavanderias. I think that's. It has its power because, again, it also has this idea of being in front of these facades that she took, many of them in Boyle Heights. And she talks about the ways in which she found striking that in walking around Cesar Chavez Avenue, she would see the ways in which the neon light affected the light, the fluorescent light coming from these lavanderias. And here she's able to stage these kinds of small dramas that take place of people who are working after working hours, right? Washing clothes and so forth. It's a very private act that she describes in some interviews. It's kind of on public display. And so maybe you could say something about this series as a kind of segue into Maria Martinez Cañas.
Right. So, you know, it's interesting that she photographed at night when I think there was a lot of life in these neighborhoods. You know, there's restaurants and lots of shops open, and, you know, services like the laundromat. But only at night could you really see this really brightly because they're so well illuminated. And, you know, she very purposefully shows us the window panes and the graffiti. So she's very much on the outside looking in. She made these with a 4x5 camera where, you know, you would cover yourself in order to compose the photograph. So there was this back and forth hiddenness of her being hidden to make the photograph. You know, these people there's kind of a back and forth between the windows that separate the people from her. And then also what's interesting to me is the way that, especially with the one on the left with these fluorescent lights that kind of go way back, she's composing this kind of sense of distance into these spaces that, you know, you don't really think about. You'd really rather not be there. And yet, you know, she's talking about all this activity that's going on, and she's talking about the realities of the city, you know, for working class people. So again, this, you know, very rigorous conceptual approach that layers documentation, and you know, it's really kind of a message about the realities of life for Mexican American people.
So that might be the best segue into now a different experience, but a very experimental also form of creating photographs. So you might say something about the totems in the next couple of series that Maria Martinez Cañas has produced.
So as I mentioned, Maria Martinez Cañas was born in Cuba in 1960. So these are photographers of more or less the same generation. I think Cristina kind of emerged in the 90s and Maria probably more in the 80s. Although I know she had a solo exhibition in Puerto Rico in 1976. So she emerged quite young. She developed this way of working with this material called rubylith fairly early in her career. It's kind of this translucent material. And she actually would cut this and make her own negatives. And so that when she, in the dark room, the parts of the rubylith, the parts of the negatives that are covered with rubylith are white, and the clear areas are black. So you get this really strong graphic image. And I think this is part of a series of 16 these very like narrow, elongated works. They take as their subject matter, I think, the modernist language of Alfredo Lam. So here she's declaring a connection to a very important Cuban modernist painter, but also I think importantly, one who also had, you know, really important connections in Europe, he worked in Europe, he knew Picasso, and he often exhibited there. And I think that becomes important later as we see another body of work.
Yeah, it's hard to tell in this image, but that's all photographic material that has been drawn, as it were, with an X-Acto knife and made into one negative, correct?
Exactly, yeah. So they're very, very precise. And the idea of a totem is also very interesting, because totems are kind of like family trees. And so the issue of exile for her has always been very present, especially in her early bodies of work. And so the idea of kind of reclaiming a figure like Wilfredo Lam and thinking about this kind of family form of the totem, it's a way of it's a way of thinking very abstractly, but a way of thinking about Cuba and her relation to that country.
So maybe we can pass on to the next series, which is the Quince Sellos Cubanos.
So another hallmark of Maria's work is working with archives. So she's worked with Lam, although very loosely and liberally. She had worked also a lot with maps, and she's worked with other photographs. And here you see her working with postage stamps. So in this series, she's paired the actual postage stamp with these images that she's made in connection with them. So she enlarges them. She uses this rubylith to create these images. And then, so for example, on the photograph, on the work on the left, you see that she's replaced the head of this Cuban general with these images of Cuban workers or Cuban architecture, and then covering his body with these spiky forms. I see Marcela.
Yes, yes.
Maybe we'll just see maybe the rebus and the diversions, and make a link to, we'll pass the lies so that we can have some time for questions. But maybe you could just say briefly, this series, which also uses the archives, both personal and art historical.
Right, so this is a series that she made about 10 years ago, and I'll go a little quickly. Rebus and diversions. So her father was an art dealer, and a great friend of Jose Gomez Sicre, who was a Cuban art historian and curator. She acquired that collection, his archives. So here you see these collaged images, more personal photos, newspaper clippings. You see in one Tina Modotti. And then the one on the right, this is an opening at MoMA in 1944 that Gomez Sicre advised about. And she's actually erased it. So she's kind of created this kind of Rauschenbergian type of gesture over a photo of aspect of Cuban history. Let's just go quickly to the others, because these works get much more complicated. And so here you see she's still working with photography, but also introducing sculptural elements, thinking about moholinage. And I think that's important because, again, she's connecting herself to European traditions. And I think there might just be one more, and I think then we've seen all the images.
Yeah, and actually, Elizabeth, I know you have one last slide, and that connects to a question that we got from several of the viewers about kind of the future of Latinx art, and what do you expect now of younger photographers?
Okay, well, so Roberto and I, we were going to talk about this a little bit more, but another thing that I talk about in the book is social media. And it really takes me all the way back to the beginning, because in these photographs that we saw of the late 1960s and early 70s, for the first time we see photographers that are from these communities, who are working, photographing people from their own communities. And today, with something like Veteranas and Rucas, which is a Instagram site founded by Guadalupe Rosales, it's also about self-representation. So I think she started this just about 5 years ago, and it has 259,000 followers. She started it as a site to document kind of the club scene, the adolescent club scene that she was a part of in the 90s. But it's grown tremendously, and so it's all about youth culture, although there's many kinds of photographs that people submit. So it's a site that is it's a democratic platform for people who want to post these kinds of pictures. So I think this is one of the things that's really important, is this idea that the book includes photographers who have MFAs and who work with conceptual approaches. and other means. But there's also this whole vein of vernacular photography that I just think is so important. I don't know where photography is going to go, but at least in terms of the scholarship, I do hope that more scholars will look into this kind of photography, because this also tells the story of our communities.
Well, that's interesting because on the one hand, it also, you talk about your own personal archive in the last afterword in the last chapter, and the degree to which works like Veteranas and Rucas is about, ties in with sort of social practice art of the present, but also to the ways in which archive is what prompts a community. And the degree to which our personal archives, like the photograph that you talk about your grandmother, had it not survived the historical record, it would not tell of those particular histories and memories.
Right, and so many of the photographers talk about their first contact with photography was through family photos. We didn't all get a chance to, go on a lot of field trips to museums, but we all had those photo albums. Our parents all had these kind of like, brownie type snapshot cameras. And so this became the starting point for so many photographers, and now we all have iPhones. And so it's become completely democratized. And, we're still accumulating these photos. People want to see themselves, and to be able to see themselves not only in, the shoebox or the photo album, but to see themselves on a site like this or these other sites. I think another one is Nueva Yorkinos. And one that I love is, I think it's called Rock Archivo LA. And there's others. They're important meeting places, for people and these memories, but also ideas that are shared. This is just another photograph from the Veteranas and Rucas site.
I think there's another, Everyday La Frontera is another good one.
Everyday La Frontera, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Elizabeth, there's a couple of questions that I'll put together, and since we're on the topic of physical archives, but so there's a question about the research for creating this book. What was it like? What archives did you research, examine?
Mm-hmm. So the research was all over the place, because there were not like a handful of books that I could consult. Many of the photographers exhibit, and they have catalogs, small catalogs, brochures. Some photographs have been interviewed by the Smithsonian, and you can find those online. There are archives in university libraries, UC Santa Barbara, UCLA, the Hunter College Center for Puerto Rican Studies, all contains this material. It was really just kind of everywhere I could find it. And then also very important was just interviews with the photographers and having them send me their own archives, making copies for me. It was a lot to pull together, and it just signified to me how, so much of this material has not been studied. And so for me, the hope is that this becomes a first step so that, future scholars will write on individual photographers or individual movements. There's just so much more work that needs to be done.
There's so many questions. I'm trying to go over them, and George, I'm sure you're seeing some. So if you see one that catches your eye, feel free to jump in. Another couple of questions that I'm trying to put together. Someone was wondering about, other photographers perhaps that are not Cuban American or Puerto Rican or Mexican American, Chicanx, that, tell us a little bit about the geographic representation of the book. And if there are some photographers that you couldn't include in the book, some, people that perhaps you would do, when you do the second volume, you would include.
Okay. Well, there's a few photographers that I would have liked to have included and didn't. There are some photographers, just like artists in general, who don't want to be categorized. And I respect that very much. I understand, everybody should be able to kind of define their own way of being interpreted. And so and it was really just a handful of photographers that I didn't include for that reason. There were other artists who I didn't include who did some really interesting photographic work, but did it earlier in their career and then moved on. So I really wanted to focus on those photographers who have really made it their career to work with the camera or lens-based work. In terms of photographers who are not from these communities, I mean, one really interesting one for me is Karen Miranda Rivadeneira, who is Ecuadorian and restaged. She's done many bodies of work, but the one that I included in the book were restagings of family memories with members of her family taking on the parts that they did 20 years ago. And that's I think a really amazing series. There are photographers who are Panamanian, Central American, but definitely the majority are from these three ethnic groups.
Roberto, did you see any that you wanted to ask?
Yeah, there's a question about the ways in which Chicanx photographers have found inspiration in Mexico. The question is there ways in which Latinx photographers, or how do they fit into the American context, those who are not Chicana, for example? And I think this has to do with the ways in which some of the photographers create their own geographies of connections to their either family narratives or countries of origin.
Yeah, I think that it's a little bit generational, right? So I think when you look at some of the documentary work that is made like in the 1970s, sort of like say after the civil rights movement. So if we look at a figure like Luis Carlos Bernal, who's widely considered the kind of father of Chicanx photography, he has a lot of involvement in Mexico and knows a lot of photographers. These, sort of very well-known figures like Manuel Alvarez Bravo, as well as younger figures. That definitely changes. I think the whole framework changes, by the millennial era, when photographers may be, second and third generation, and maybe never, going back to their countries. I think one kind of interesting point of discussion, though, is Puerto Rican photographers, who do tend to go back and forth. There is not a huge photographic history in Puerto Rico, but they are kind of going back and forth very, very frequently. A lot of photographers who are based in Puerto Rico often come to the United States to get their MFAs and then go back. And a lot of photographers who live in New York and other cities, they're going back to visit family. So there's, I think, a very interesting dialogue with Puerto Rican photographers between the Caribbean and the Northeast.
And as you mentioned, Puerto Rico plays a very important role in your book as well. There's an entire chapter dedicated to it. But I was impressed, and I couldn't help remarking how many photographers who are not from Puerto Rico, many from Cuba, like Maria Martinez Cañas, Felix Gonzalez Torres, had spent significant time in Puerto Rico, right? I think it's Maria Martinez Cañas says that she's Cuban-born, Puerto Rican raised, U.S. American citizen, right? And that that is an interesting way in which these complex stories find some way of being represented in the image, but also in the narratives that they tell.
Yeah, and Puerto Rico in the late 1970s actually had an interesting photography scene. There was a institution called Casa Aboy, which I think still exists. And they gave Maria Martinez Cañas her first show, the one I mentioned in 1976. I think Felix Gonzalez Torres had one of his first shows there. And then also later in the 80s, Enfoco, which is an organization I wish we had had more time to talk about, but that was an organization founded by New York Puerto Rican photographers in the mid 1970s. And they were doing kind of colloquios and symposia in San Juan, so bringing New York photographers to San Juan and vice versa. So there's these kind of cruxes of places where things are happening, and then they kind of dissipate and then come back. But these kinds of institutions, and Enfoco especially, are just so important to the way that these photographers have been able to find support and platforms.
I think we have maybe time for one more. We're over time, but I want to ask this question because a couple of people were wondering about Texas and the Southwest. Vincent Valdez, the great artist, asks Elizabeth, the subject of Latinx art history in America often focuses on artists from the West and East Coast, and often excludes the contributions and influences from Latinx artists in the South and Southwest. Can you speak briefly about artists like Kathy Vargas, I would add Delilah Montoya, who helped to shape photography both regionally and nationally since the 70s? And maybe we'll conclude with that.
Yeah, so there's a few photographers from Chicago in the book that are based in Chicago, Indiana, somebody who teaches at Notre Dame. Kathy Vargas is a dear old friend, actually is sort of an impetus for me writing this book, because I've known her for so long. And I think she has a very important history. And then Delilah I actually include, I think, in like 3 different chapters, because I talk about her when we talk about geographies, and I talk about the work that she did at the border. And I also talk about Delilah when I talk about family. She actually ends that chapter because one of her recent series of work is called castas, based on the idea, the European paintings of castas, or racial hierarchies in the Americas. And she actually found families who worked with her. She took the DNA of one of the members, and then she mapped their whole histories, which would contain a Latin American country, but also Europe and Africa and parts of Asia, and then created these massive family portraits. One other photographer from Texas who's in the book is Chuy Benitez, who's younger and who's made these really beautiful panoramic photographs of everyday life in and around Houston.
And Chuck
So
Ramirez.
Texas is represented.
Yeah, Chuck Ramirez is also there.
Yeah.
Right, one of the questions mentions Chuck Ramirez, which I think also speaks to the importance of certain cities and as art producing and photography producing, and San Antonio and Houston, as Vincent mentions, were definitely important in that regard.
Yes, and Chuck's in the book. It was hard. It was actually hard to decide which photograph to use, because his just visually his work is so stunning.
I think you chose the right one.
Thank you.
Well, I think we're going to conclude with that. A couple of questions that I saw also where people were asking if this is going to be recorded. It's being recorded. It's going to be on YouTube. Give us a couple of days. It'll be up. So yeah, thank you so much, Roberto and Elizabeth. This has been
Thank you.
incredible. We're honored. As I said before, it's not an understatement. This has been really great. And before I conclude, I want to thank Megan Hoyer, Director of Public Programs, and Andy Hawks for organizing this and doing such a splendid job. And for everyone who tuned in tonight, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcela.
Thank you, Roberto and Marcela.